Good morning. I'm Muriel Bowser, and today I called a briefing so that public safety officials could be available for questions related to the district's release of historic body-worn camera footage. Last week, I signed emergency legislation that expands the district's body-worn camera law to include the release of officer involved deaths. Importantly, that legislation also ensures the right of families to privacy and allows them to be a part of the release decision process. Today, we are releasing body-worn camera footage for 3 fatal incidents. At the request of families, recordings of 4 others are not being released. We know that any loss of life is tragic, and as you review the footage, which will be made available on the district's websites, and we'll provide that information, I implore you to remember that there are families whose lives have been forever changed by these incidents. In all cases, including those where the family has chosen not to release footage, I ask that you respect their privacy. I've been joined by the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, Kevin Donahue, and we are happy to take any questions. Questions? Yes.
Mayor, why did you decide to sign this legislation? Obviously, it's somewhat controversial, but your decision to sign.
Well, I think that we worked with the council. I have explained previously my concerns about rushing to make changes to the law without adequate public input, and I remain concerned about that. I'm especially concerned about unintended consequences that haven't been thoroughly thought through. The council amended some and made adjustments to the emergency to address some of my concerns.
What did they change?
Kevin?
There are 2 changes that are notable. One that we're talking about today is the clarification of the role of the families of the decedents in the case of body-worn cameras to have the ability to not consent to their release, and a process that's trauma-informed to try to engage them, allow them to view it privately. There are another provision that was significant that was adjusted that is out of the kind of conversation one has after a public hearing, but it did not happen here, which is that was the in the original emergency legislation, there was a provision around non-fatal use of force and the conditions in which an officer can make a stop in which the use of force is non-fatal. There's still a provision around fatal use of force, and the provision changed the standard from reasonable suspicion to probable cause, which in the world of jurisprudence is a really significant change to a long track record of precedent that requires a lot more conversation to think through the impact of telling an officer you can only stop someone involuntarily if you have probable cause. That's a really big change. And after discussions, that was removed from the original draft. The fatal use of force is still put in there, but that in this short time, I'm not doing justice to how large a change that is to police practice and court practice. And in an emergency legislation, there's simply not the time to have that kind of deliberative back and forth to understand the implications of what's in the law. So those are 2 examples of adjustments made to be able to, between the first and the second version of the emergency legislation.
I guess for the mayor, are you still wanting the council to go ahead and have hearings and all that sort of thing?
I believe that they introduced a piece of permanent legislation. As you know, emergency legislation lasts for 90 days, and I'm told that they will have hearings on the permanent version. Yes. Yes.
What lessons are you learning in terms of officers turning on their body cameras? For example, in the third video we saw, there were 3 officers, and the third one only began rolling once the incident was in place, was rolling. So are you making any changes to body cam policy?
Which video are you referring to?
That was the video of Mr. Alston.
Okay, I'm going to ask Kevin to address that.
Two things. So, first of all, I think that third officer may have entered the scene later than the other 2, which may explain why the camera comes on a little bit later. But to your broader question about what we do to try to reinforce when you turn it on, it is something that our line level supervisors at MPD remind officers of on a very regular basis. Is something that they can get disciplined for. In addition to that, because people make in good faith mistakes, we have requested that the camera records more automatically. So every camera, when they first rolled out this program, recorded 30 seconds all the time. So it's always recording 30 seconds. So when you hit the on button of the camera, it automatically turns on the audio, but you still get that 30 seconds. That has expanded to, I think, 2 minutes, and we've requested to expand further and further. So for an officer who forgets to turn it on, it would record the time frame in which it might take for them to have that decision be triggered. So you still would get a automatic recording all the time of more and more time. And I think that would allow for there to be far fewer instances without camera coverage.
Yes.
A question for the chief. Question for the chief. What does he make of today's release?
There's 2 sides. I have 2 thoughts on it. My first thought is I can't even begin to imagine how the families feel to have to watch the video of the loss of the life of a loved one, and to those families, and as the mayor said, even the families who chose not to have their videos be public, I want to extend my condolences to those families for losing a loved one. On the second part, the council has determined that this is the statute, that's the law of the land, and we're going to abide by it.
Yes.
Question for Chief Newsham.
What's the question?
For the Daquan Young video, we understand that was an off-duty officer, and I'm wondering if the video gives us any clarification on whether or not that officer identified himself as police in that altercation.
Well, we are making the video available, and Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk to that point.
The videos themselves are what they are, which is to say they resolve some questions that people may have, but they don't resolve others. That particular video is a video that, because it's a video from the rec center building, there's no audio to it, and the officer is off duty. In other words, he's dressed like anyone else is dressed while having a day off, and so there's no camera he's wearing, and you're just not going to hear the dialogue between the two. We know what reports were made in interviews after the fact with the officer involved, but the videos aren't they're not going to resolve every question that people would ideally like a video to answer, and they may never.
Sure. Well, can I follow up?
Yes.
Based on the interviews afterward, do we know whether or not he identified himself?
We don't believe that he did identify himself as a police officer.
Thank you.
Anybody that hasn't asked? Sam?
Okay. I had a question for the chief on this Jeffrey Price thing. You said that the officer failed to stop at the stop sign and he was sanctioned in some way. I'm just wondering, what was that? What happened?
I think that he was issued a suspension of 5 days, is that right? Of 6 days, and a portion of that was in abeyance. So I think that it was a 1-day suspension in effect.
So he was suspended without pay for a day?
Chief?
Yes. He was suspended.
Without pay for 1 day?
Yes, and he has 5 days hanging over his head in the event he's involved in similar behavior.
So Chief, can we follow up on that? Because you had told us that the incident report found that the accident could have been avoidable. That
It's preventable.
Preventable, the crash. So could that officer have prevented that if he had stopped at that stop sign? Could he have, was it?
Well, you know, I think you know this, Mark, that there is a lawsuit pending, and I know that the attorneys on both sides, well, maybe not on both sides, but I know the attorneys are, they don't want me to share a lot of detail regarding this case. I will say this, that was a tragic accident where a young man lost his life. I don't know what else to say to that. I think, you know, people know what happens in car crashes. I think the video lends information that we know is factual in nature, and as the deputy mayor said, people can draw their own conclusions as to what happened.
Does the crash data recorder or whatever the device in the vehicle give you any other insight as to whether the officer tried to avoid the accident?
Our vehicles do have crash data recorders in them, at least that vehicle did. And what the crash data recorder does, it provides information regarding braking, regarding speed, regarding acceleration, and a few other things that escape me right now. But that data was used in the investigation, and I can say that the data from the crash data recorder corroborated the statement that we received from the officer.
Which was?
I don't think I want to go into that detail.
Yes.
For the mayor, in one video, we see footage of uninvolved officers. That's in the case of Mr. Young. Officers came after and administered first aid. In another video of Mr. Price, there were officers who were there, who arrived after the crash, whose video was not shown. Are you working to clarify the policy on when the police will release footage from body-worn cameras of officers who were not directly involved in the death of the person?
Well, the law, I think, is explicit about that. Kevin, can you review the law?
The law clearly says for the officer that was directly caused, whether the action is justified or not is separate. So when we look at that, that is an officer who, if it's a firearm death, who drew a gun and pulled the trigger. If it's a car crash, the individual driving the car. I fully expect there to be, again, this is, as an emergency bill, there wasn't a public hearing. I fully expect there to continue to be dialogue and discussion about the legislative intent and definitions, but we did with fidelity an attempt to define cause in the most common sense way, which is that if you're driving the car and the death is the result of a car crash, that's the camera that we release. If you are somehow else on scene, but we're not the person driving the car, the law does not apply to you. An attorney for a family or a family still has legal means through discovery to be able to expand what is releasable to them. But we try to take the most common sense definition of who's involved.
Yes.
A follow to that, Deputy Mayor, there are some instances where you release more footage, correct? I'm thinking now of the second, was it, it's slipping me. You released more footage and released rec footage. So can you clarify in what instances will you release footage that, this was for Mr. Young, in which you'll release more footage outside of when it's an officer involved? Yeah.
For what will be put online will include raw footage that will go beyond what was shown to you prior to this press conference. In some cases, for example, I believe in the case of Jeffrey Price, the officer who was involved, that footage just continues for almost 2 hours, and that raw footage will be put online. The case of Mr. Young was a unique case in which the video was not a body camera video. There was some public dialogue that included a belief that people came to authentically on their own right, that they believed that there was some body camera footage out there. And so absent that, we did the best we could trying to take the spirit of the law and apply it to that, which is there was video of the incident, which we put out. And to highlight what existed of the BWC, which did not include the incident, we put out that video because it was our attempt to show this is what we have. We don't have it of the incident from those body cameras we have when officers arrived at the scene. And that was our best attempt to navigate what the law allows for.
Yes, Mark.
So all these three incidents date back to 2018, and certainly in two of, well, let me ask, Chief, with the exception of the one with the officer who ran the stop sign, is there any indication from any of these videos that any officers violated any protocol, any regulations, any laws, did anything wrong in these three incidents?
Well, Mark, let me just say that in the case of Mr. Young and Mr. Austin, our use of force review board found that they were justified and within MPD policy. Those cases have also been reviewed by the United States Attorney, which declined to prosecute. In the case of Mr. Price, we classify that as a traffic crash that was preventable, I think is the terminology you use, but no use of force.
And so I guess my question is, why did it take more than 2 years and council legislation for you to release this video that the families and press and the public have been asking for years now?
Well, Mark, we actually followed the law. I think, as you know, we've had a law and policies in place related to body-worn camera since their inception. And part of that law said that the Office of the Attorney General would make a recommendation, the U.S. Attorney would make a recommendation, that families could view the video, the council could request the video, and beyond all of that, I could make a determination of significant public interest, taking all of that into account, and taking into account how justice would be served by a decision. Prior to today, we have released, I think, 3 videos based on all of that feedback that we determined should be released, and today we'll issue more.
Right, so I don't know why you waited so long. Why did it take a law?
Having
You had the power to do it before this. You had the authority.
I just explained to you all of the things that I take into consideration when making those determinations. So based on recommendations, based on how we thought public justice would be served, we did not release the video. We are releasing the video today. Any other questions?
And then,
Yes.
The families in all 3, or at least in the 2 shooting cases that I followed, the families have complained, even up to today, the family of Mr. Alston complaining that it's been really hard for them to get any information out of MPD, and you know, they were not allowed to see the video, and I'm not sure that
But I think you know that that's not the case, Mark. The families, I think in every case, and Kevin will correct me if I'm wrong, have been offered to see the video in close proximity and time to the incidents, and all have been recently offered to see the video. Please.
So the family of Marquise Alston has seen the video 2 times before today. So they've been given an opportunity to see the video. I don't believe that the family in Jeffrey Price's case has seen the video. That was a car crash, and there was no release of that video in that case. And I don't believe that Daquan Young saw any video because that was an off-duty officer, and there was no body-worn camera that showed the actual shooting in that case.
Is that it?
Can, off topic,
Uh-huh.
Chief, could your office did clarify this for me, but on the shooting death of George Coleman, and I'm sorry I don't have the date, but it turns out he was a former police cadet. And can you provide any clarity on, this is the first we're hearing about this, was he a cadet at the time of the shooting? And were there other cadets at the party at the house when he was shot?
I think I haven't looked at that case in a little while. This was a kid who I actually knew pretty well. He was a nice kid, really, really good kid. And he, unfortunately, was the victim of a homicide in Ward 8. He obviously, there was a party where the shooting occurred, and I do believe that there were other cadets at the party.
So, but was he a cadet at the time he was shot?
He was not. He had resigned.
But there were active cadets.
There were cadets at the party,
And
and,
so
and
it's still-
they were, I can tell you, he's, like I said, nice kid. They were heartbroken when they found out that he had been killed
And
by
are all
gun
those
violence.
Cadets still cadets or still in the cadet program, or are they now officers, or?
Oh, I don't have that information. If you want to follow up, I can get it for you. I think most of those folks are still cadets.
Okay.
Yes.
For the mayor, a few days ago, you mentioned when you were talking about large gatherings of folks in regards to COVID, whether it be a concert or something else, who are not wearing masks, not social distancing, that you wanted to see the ANC commissioners and other community members step up to help mitigate that. I've heard from some of those community leaders, and they've said they don't feel like they're getting enough support from the city, and they don't have enough power to actually do anything. I'm just curious what you would say to them.
Well, I've been an ANC commissioner, and it's true. ANC commissioners, they aren't executors of the law, but I think there are a lot of ANC commissioners out there who see it as their job because they ran for those positions to make their communities better. So I'm happy to talk with those commissioners and community leaders about how we can be supportive. Yes.
When enforcing the masks, I wonder, has your office considered passing masks out to folks when they aren't compliant with our law or anything?
I think we have a few of our constituency offices that are doing that at various events already.
To quickly, my understanding is MPD would be enforcing this as well, right? And so I'm wondering, is that also a consideration as opposed to fining people, giving them masks so that they could?
Yes, that is a consideration. Yes.
Yes, Mayor, we did a story last night on the Sharpton group that's having the march, released rules for people attending, and they said those rules include distribution of masks, thermometer checks, and restricted access to buses that are coming from COVID hotspot cities. Does that, I don't know, what's your reaction to that? Does that comply?
Well, it sounds like the organizers are trying to keep a mass gathering safe. So I think that is encouraging news.
Okay, does it comply with your order if they're coming into cities and say, they just decide to get on a plane and come here?
If we have are you talking about the quarantine order?
Yes, ma'am.
So if we have a quarantine order still in effect, I have to emphasize that no one should look at the quarantine order as a punishment, okay? It is guidance from health officials to keep our city safe, and other states and cities have similar guidance. So people who are making personal decisions to travel, or other activity for that matter, have to consider how it impacts other people. And that is the purpose of quarantine guidance, whether you're traveling for essential activity or non-essential activity. You have to follow health guidance. We have very specific guidance for non-essential travelers and other guidance for essential travelers. And so anybody traveling to the city for any purpose should consult that guidance.
Now, on the 4th of July, you suggested people stay away. If the quarantine is still in effect, would that be your suggestion for people for the march?
I certainly will consider what the health metrics suggest closer to that time. Yes.
Can I just circle back to the body cam?
Sure.
Have you reviewed these yourself?
Yes.
Just what is your thoughts after reviewing these videos, knowing that family members and the public are going to look at them? Just what's your thought and your guidance to the public?
You know, Mark, it is reviewing body-worn camera footage, and I review it all at the time. So I'm not just reviewing it because there's been a law passed, but I review it and give it very careful consideration at the time that there is an officer-involved death. It is hard to watch on almost all cases. It is, I think, a lot of people when, to Deputy Mayor Donahue's earlier point, I think sometimes people think that in viewing the body-worn camera footage that it's going to tell the whole story, and it doesn't. And frequently that is, people are felt left still wanting to know more. I think people think it'll be like watching a TV show where it's all clear footage coming from different angles. And in fact, what it is a camera that's on an officer's chest that sometimes doesn't show anything, or it'll show something after the fact, as some of your questions have already alluded to. But at the end, somebody died, and that's hard and painful to watch. But it also shows the very difficult positions that our officers face, and in the very difficult experience following somebody's death and trying to get aid to them so that they live. So watching body-worn camera footage is a very hard part of my job. Taking in the information to make decisions about public safety and justice related to body-worn camera is also a hard but necessary part of my job. Thank you, everybody.